Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a closer look at, well, a really common, very powerful image of the Holocaust. This idea of it being a highly efficient, industrialized um, factory of death.
Right.
And we're drawing on insights from Professor Peter Hayes of Northwestern University using excerpts from one of his lectures.
Yeah, he really challenges that image.
Exactly. Our goal really is to get underneath why this dominant picture, which, seems to fit certain visuals we all know, actually kind of misrepresents how the vast majority of Jewish people were murdered.
It's actually quite striking how strong the factories of death idea is, isn't it?
It really is.
You think Holocaust, and Professor Hayes points this out, certain images just pop into your head, the gate at Birkenau,
Yeah.
that infamous train ramp for the Hungarian Jews, the brick gas chambers, the crematoria.
Yeah, those are the images.
They're incredibly potent symbols, no doubt, but his argument is that they can um, really lead us down the wrong path in understanding the bigger picture.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this a bit. Professor Hayes is saying this picture of a slick, orderly, almost assembly line kind of murder. It just doesn't hold up for most victims.
That's the core of it. Even at Birkenau itself, those very familiar images, they don't actually capture the full horror or even the typical experience for much of its operation.
How so? What was happening before those big brick buildings went up?
Well, that's the thing. Those large brick gas chambers and crematoria at Birkenau, the ones we see in photos, they weren't even operational until 1943.
1943, really?
Yes. Before that, for quite a significant period, the killing methods were, frankly, much more primitive.
Primitive. You mean smaller scale or actually just sort of cruder technology?
Much cruder,
Yeah.
more fundamental. Until the spring of 43, the gassing there actually took place in two small existing peasant farmhouses, just regular little houses that were slightly modified.
Farmhouses.
Yes, and they had no proper ventilation for, continuous use, and initially, no crematoria at all.
So what happened to the bodies?
They were just dumped into pits. Later on, they started burning them in the open air. It's a scene that's just worlds away from that industrialized image we carry.
And it wasn't just the buildings themselves creating this misleading picture. You mentioned the Auschwitz album earlier. Those photos of the Hungarian Jews arriving in 44. They look like stark evidence, but there's more to it.
Oh, absolutely. Context is everything there. That album was basically like a visual report for SS higher-ups.
A report.
Yeah, the photos were specifically staged to show how supposedly efficient the process was, especially how they processed the victims' belongings after they were selected. You know that famous picture of piles of luggage being sorted?
Yes, I do.
That served a very specific propaganda purpose. It was meant to impress.
Wow. So it was a performance in a way. A curated narrative.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And here's a crucial detail. Those photos were taken in broad daylight.
Okay. And why is that significant?
Because Professor Hayes notes that most transports, especially those large ones from Hungary later on, actually arrived at night.
And not
Yes. They used the darkness, powerful searchlights. It was all deliberately done to disorient people, to make them easier to manage, to control. So the album gives this sanitized, almost orderly daytime view of what was usually a chaotic, terrifying nighttime experience.
That really forces a different perspective, doesn't it? Because Auschwitz-Birkenau looms so large in our minds. It's the symbol, the ultimate death factory.
It absolutely is.
But Professor Hayes hits us with this fact that by the time those big killing facilities were even running in 1943, a huge portion of the Holocaust victims were already dead.
It's a staggering statistic and absolutely critical. By 1943, an estimated 75%, three-quarters of all the Jewish people who would be murdered in the Holocaust had already perished.
75%. Before the main Auschwitz facilities were even fully operational.
Correct. And overall, only about 15%, maybe 1/6 or so, of the total killings actually ever happened at Auschwitz-Birkenau.
15%. That completely upends the common understanding.
It really does. It changes the timeline, the geography, everything.
Okay, so if it wasn't primarily Auschwitz-Birkenau and not this industrial model for most victims, how did the majority die? The numbers are just horrifyingly vast. Where did it happen? How?
Well, that's the crucial question, isn't it? It points to the sheer breadth and variety of the killing methods. At the peak, Jews were being murdered all across the occupied East, in countless villages, in forests.
Out in the open.
Often, yes. Professor Hayes mentions specific sites that maybe aren't as well known. The old forts around Kovno in Lithuania, the Paneriai Forest near Vilnius, the ravines at Babi Yar outside Kiev. These were sites of horrific mass shootings.
Carried out by whom?
Primarily by German units, the Einsatzgruppen, these mobile killing squads, often with help from local collaborators. Just brutal face-to-face violence.
So nothing like the image of passively entering a gas chamber in some huge centralized place.
Not at all. And alongside those mass shootings, you had these other dedicated killing centers in what was pre-war Poland. 4 of them: Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka.
Right, the carbon monoxide camps.
Exactly. They formed a sort of deadly circle around the heartland of Poland, and their mission was stark: kill the Jewish populations in their assigned regions and then basically disappear, be dismantled.
And Professor Hayes emphasizes how, well, primitive these places were, especially compared to later Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Yes, very much so. Unlike Auschwitz, these 4 camps weren't really set up as long-term concentration or labor camps. Their primary, almost sole function was immediate extermination.
And the numbers are staggering there, too.
Immense. Nearly 2 million people were murdered in those 4 carbon monoxide camps alone. Add that to the roughly 2 million killed by the shooting units.
That's 4 million people right there, outside of Auschwitz's main killing period.
Correct. And the killing in these camps and in the shootings was marked by just shocking inefficiency in terms of resources, but maximum cruelty. It's a grim paradox.
You keep mentioning the primitive nature, the lack of resources. Makeshift seems like the word.
Yeah, it really is. They used scavenged materials, adapted existing structures. It paints a picture of almost desperate, brutal improvisation, not cold, calculated industrial planning.
They didn't even build them from scratch always.
Often not. Just like the shooting sites near Kovno or Vilnius, which used existing forts or forests, these camps were frequently set up where some infrastructure already existed. A rail spur, an old building, something to minimize the construction effort.
Okay, let's maybe walk through them briefly. Chelmno, you said that started with an old manor house.
That's right. Chelmno started operations quite early, October 1941. The SS basically took over this rundown manor. Very little prep, needed some fencing, boarding up windows.
And the killing method.
Incredibly crude. They packed people into vans and piped in the exhaust fumes. Gas vans. And dealing with the bodies, the victims' belongings, it was equally primitive. Storage overflowed. They used mass graves initially. Later, they built some short-lived open-air cremation pyres. So right from the start, you see this pattern. Adapt, improvise, use what's available, however horrifying.
Then Belzec, a small site near a railway.
Belzec was also small, built very quickly on a slope near a rail line. The first gas chambers were made of wood, built by forced Jewish laborers. And apparently they were built too close to the tracks initially, which just added another layer of horror.
Were they effective? I mean, in their grim purpose?
They had frequent problems with the engines producing the carbon monoxide, but the rate of killing was still just devastatingly high. And crucially, like Chelmno initially, no crematoria, just open pits for burning bodies. The whole site was dismantled and camouflaged by mid-1943. Gone.
Highlighting that temporary nature again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These weren't meant to be permanent monuments to murder like parts of Auschwitz became.
In Sobibor, similar story.
Very similar pattern, yes. Modeled on Belzec, but a bit larger. They actually cannibalized existing houses nearby for building materials.
Wow.
Same horrific routine. Arrivals forced to strip naked, driven into the gas chambers. The first brick gas chambers they built turned out to be too small, so they had to replace them. And again, like Belzec, disposal was by open-air burning.
And the last one, Treblinka. Professor Hayes said it might have killed almost as many as Birkenau, but faster.
Treblinka was horrifically lethal, especially in its first few months, late summer, fall of 42. Just a frenzy of killing. Reports suggest maybe 56,000 victims a week during that peak.
56,000 a week.
It's almost incomprehensible. Transports arrived faster than they could process them. People died waiting in the rail cars. The camp even had a separate concealed killing area hidden behind an earth wall.
But still basic infrastructure.
Still fundamentally basic. When they needed bigger gas chambers, they built them using bricks they salvaged from a blown-up chimney in a nearby Polish town.
Salvaged bricks.
Yes. And just like the others, open-air burning was the method for disposing of bodies. So across all 4 of these camps, Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, you see this consistent picture. Rapid, makeshift construction, simple carbon monoxide gassing technology, crude body disposal. It's just not the factory we picture.
So if we pull back and look at these 4 camps together,
Yeah.
what are the main points that really push back against that industrial death factory idea?
Well, several things really stand out. First, the timeline is just so compressed and early.
Right, you mentioned that intense period.
Exactly. That core killing period was really just 11 months, March 42 to January 43. In that short window, half of all the Holocaust Jewish victims died. Half.
11 months.
And two-thirds of those deaths, so a third of the total Holocaust victims, died either in these 4 carbon monoxide camps or on the trains getting there. And the absolute peak, even shorter, just over 3 months, late July to early November 42, saw almost a quarter of all Jewish victims perish.
A quarter of the total deaths in just over 3 months, mostly in these primitive camps.
Yes. That sheer concentration of rapid, relatively low-tech killing fundamentally challenges the idea of some gradual, planned, industrialized process unfolding over years.
And the logistics you mentioned, using local trains, that also feeds into this.
It absolutely does. It shows this chillingly systematic approach, but one that relied on existing everyday infrastructure.
Not special deportation trains always.
Often just local commuter trains, repurposed for murder.
Yeah.
The maps tracking transports to Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka show how they use the existing local rail network to funnel people from specific regions. It underscores the opportunistic and resource-limited nature of the operation. It wasn't diverting massive national resources. It was using what was readily available locally.
Which brings up that other point you raised, the massive ideological weight the Nazis place on the Holocaust compared to the, well, surprisingly minimal resources they seem to put into these specific killing operations.
It's a profound and disturbing disconnect, isn't it? This was central to Nazi ideology, their worldview, yet these key extermination camps were run with remarkably few German personnel.
Really? Who did the work then?
Much of the guard duty and the horrific labor was forced upon auxiliary units, often recruited from Soviet POW camps, Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians, the so-called Traniki men.
So it wasn't even primarily Germans staffing these places.
Not in terms of numbers on the ground doing the dirtiest work. It highlights, again, how they achieved this ideological goal using inexpensive, readily available, non-German manpower, alongside brutal German oversight, of course. It wasn't about building a gleaming, efficient factory in the modern sense. It was about achieving mass murder quickly and cheaply with whatever and whoever was at hand.
So let's talk about the consequences of holding on to that industrial death factory image.
Yeah.
Why does Professor Hayes argue it's so important to understand this other, more primitive reality?
Yeah.
What's the danger of the metaphor?
Well, there are a few serious consequences. First, that factory language, even unintentionally, can sort of dehumanize. It risks reducing the victims to just inputs in some abstract process.
Oh, it distances us from the actual violence?
Exactly. It obscures the intense personal viciousness, the face-to-face cruelty, the sheer gore and filth involved in both the shootings and these early camps. Second, it sets up misleading comparisons today. When we hear factory, we think of, I don't know, maybe clean, automated, perhaps monotonous places. That's the opposite of the squalor, the chaos, the constant danger and brutality of these killing sites.
And the third point you mentioned earlier is how it skews our focus onto Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Precisely. Because the later stages of Birkenau do look more industrial with the big crematoria, the metaphor seems to fit there best. So it reinforces Auschwitz's position in our memory as the Holocaust's capital.
Even though, as you said, 85% of the Jewish victims died elsewhere.
Exactly. 85% died elsewhere, often in these far less industrial ways, shot in pits, gassed in crude chambers at Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Chelmno. And here's another sobering thought. Survival rates from those other death camps were vastly lower than from Auschwitz.
Why was that?
Because their only function was immediate death. There wasn't the large-scale selection for slave labor that existed, for better or worse, at Auschwitz-Birkenau for part of its history. If you arrived at Treblinka or Sobibor or Belzec, your chances of surviving more than a few hours were almost zero. That underscores their primary function as pure extermination centers.
So Professor Hayes really wants us to drop that metaphor, the factory of death. Why is that shift in language so critical for him?
His main point, I think, is that by moving away from the factory idea, we can actually focus more clearly on the unspeakable degradation and the sheer raw brutality inflicted on human beings. And the fact that it was done in large part in this incredibly inexpensive, low-tech, almost improvised way.
So it forces us to confront the human element more directly, both the perpetrators and the victims.
Yes. It shifts the focus from some imagined, impersonal machine to the reality of intense personal cruelty and suffering in these incredibly varied killing sites. It might help us grapple more honestly with the perpetrator's motivations and the victim's experiences, face to face with the horror, without the distancing effect of the factory image.
This has been, well, a really crucial deep dive. It definitely challenges some very ingrained ideas about the Holocaust. We've explored how that common picture, the factory of death, mostly drawn from late-stage Auschwitz-Birkenau, kind of overshadows the reality for most victims.
Yeah, the reality was often more widespread, much more primitive, and involved incredibly direct, brutal methods of killing. That's where the majority of the deaths occurred.
It's quite something to realize how that idea of efficiency we associate with factories can actually mask the sheer chaos, the lack of resources, and the intense up-close cruelty of places like Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, not to mention the mass shootings.
It really forces a recalibration of how we visualize and understand the mechanics of the genocide.
So maybe something for you, the listener, to think about. How might that persistent factory metaphor, however unintentionally, sort of sanitize the Holocaust? Could shifting focus, as Professor Hayes suggests, towards the more primitive, the more personal, the more makeshift nature of so much of the killing, could that lead to a deeper, perhaps even more disturbing, but ultimately truer understanding?
It's definitely worth considering.
We'd really encourage you, if this sparked your interest, to look further into the specific histories of Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and the Einsatzgruppen actions. It paints a much fuller, much more complex, and frankly, much more horrifying picture of the Holocaust. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.